Did you know Tolkien started writing a sequel to The Lord of the Rings called The New Shadow? Of course you did. There's already a dozen videos on YouTube about it. So we're not going to be talking about The New Shadow. We're going to be talking about a story that's even more niche. A story so niche that you can be a hardcore Tolkien fan and still not even have heard of it. In this video, we talk about Tal-Elmar, Tolkien's strangest tale. Okay, so if your first thought is, what the hell is Tal-Elmar? Don't worry, that's a fantastic question. In his time, Tolkien wrote a lot of short stories, many of which were never finished. Most of these were conveniently compiled together in the Unfinished Tales, but some of them remained scattered throughout works such as the History of Middle-earth. In the final section of the final volume of that series, The Peoples of Middle-earth, one can find The New Shadow, and rather conveniently, you can find Tal-Elmar directly below it. But unlike The New Shadow, no one ever talks about Tal-Elmar, and there's a reason for that. Seemingly written in 1955, Tal-Elmar is rather unique when it comes to Tolkien's stories. You see, almost everything else in the Legendarium comes from the perspective of the good guys. The elves, Durin's folk, the hobbits, and the Edain and their descendants, the Númenóreans and the Dúnedain. There's very few exceptions to this rule, like in The Hunt for the Ring, where we sort of get both the Witch King and Saruman's perspectives for a short amount of time. But Tal-Elmar is even more niche than that. It's from the perspective of the pre-Númenóreans. These were men related to the Edain who never went west to Beleriand, and instead ended up settling in the lands that would be known as Eriador, Rohan, and Gondor. These men were the ancestors of the Dunlendings, the Men of Bree, the Men of the Mountains, and the men of non-Númenórean origin who would end up being integrated into Gondor. Throughout Middle-earth's history, they had mixed fortunes, and were mostly bystanders when it came to the great events of the Second and Third Age. So why would Tolkien write a story from their perspective when they didn't really do all that much? We have no idea, but it's interesting nonetheless. So I'm going to give a brief summary of it in this video. The story is set sometime in the late Second Age and starts from the perspective of an older man named Hazad Longbeard, renowned for the length of his beard, his wisdom, and the fact that he has 17 sons. He lives in a town called Agar, which is in a land known as the Hills of Agar. Hazad's youngest and favourite son is Tal-Elmar. Tal-Elmar is an oddity. Whereas the people of Agar are short, broad, and darker of skin, Tal-Elmar is tall, fair-haired, and has grey eyes. The reason for this is that Hazad's mother was not a native. She belonged to a group only known as the Fell Folk of the East. Like Tal-Elmar, tall, fair-haired, and carrying weapons that are supposedly made by fiery demons in the Eastern Hills. They're slowly moving westwards, driving the pre-Númenóreans from their lands. But in an event called the Battle of Ishmalog, a convoy of these fell folk were ambushed and destroyed by an army belonging to the North King. Hazad's father, Buldar, who fought in the battle, took one of the women captive, Elmar. Now to say that Elmar didn't enjoy living in Agar would be an understatement. Buldar loved her and treated her well, but obviously Elmar didn't take kindly to being away from her people. She seemingly placed a curse on Agar and its people. As long as she remained captive, Agar's fortunes would fade, and that would be doubly true for Buldar and his line. And on top of that, she gave an ominous warning, stating that after she died, one would arise that would be hers alone, and with their rise would come the end of their people and the downfall of their king. Hazad was the youngest son of Buldar and Elmar, and he loved his mother dearly, hence why he loved Tal-Elmar so much. However, Elmar's curse ran true, the fortunes of Agar faded, and Hazad had fallen on hard times. Thanks, Mum. Shortly afterwards, Hazad and Tal-Elmar are conversing on a hill when they notice sails in the distance. Even though they haven't been seen in many years, they know these are the ships of the Gohileg, the High Men of the Sea, the Númenóreans. The Númenóreans have a bad reputation amongst the people of Agar. They are said to worship death. They build dark fortresses and tombs along the coast, they drive the natives from their land, and they take them as slaves back to whatever the land they came from. Now, while the Númenóreans would end up being guilty of all of these things, we don't know when this story is set, so we're unsure if these beliefs hold weight at the moment, or whether it's just propaganda. Regardless, the Númenóreans have come. Hazad and Tal-Elmar go warn Mogru, the master of Agar. He's kind of a piece of shit who hates Tal-Elmar for being different, and who looks down on Hazad for being misfortunate. After some back and forth, he commands Tal-Elmar to go warn the neighbouring villagers, but first says he must go spy on the Númenóreans. While Hazad and Tal-Elmar both recognise that Mogru is just trying to get rid of Tal-Elmar, his word is law, so off Tal-Elmar goes. He does, however, leave Mogru with an ominous warning of his own, and steals his staff for good measure. He makes his way down to the beach and spies on the Númenóreans as they make camp. After a while, he reveals himself to them. At first, the Númenóreans actually mistake him for an elf, but they quickly realise that he's just a man and take him prisoner, although they don't treat him poorly. The story gets a bit jumbled here, as so many Tolkien stories do, but it gets very interesting. Tal-Elmar finds himself being able to understand their speech, most likely Sindarin, indicating that they are elf friends, as he's heard it in his dreams. They theorise that he must be of Númenórean descent, or at least akin to them, and from their speech he also learns that they're allied with the Cruels of the North, and that they plan to threaten the king. Then Tal-Elmar finds himself able to speak the language, which shocks the Númenóreans. Tal-Elmar asks if he's going to be sacrificed to the dark, pointing out that one of the Númenórean ships has black sails. But the Númenóreans inform him that the black-sailed ship has stars, which are a tribute to Elbereth, Vatha, and they also point out that they do not worship the dark, but that Tal-Elmar and his people do. Tal-Elmar counters that not all of them worship the dark, but the story ends with this rather grim line, said by the Númenóreans. Alas, your time of dwelling in these hills is come to an end. Here the men of the West have resolved to make their homes, and the folk of the dark must depart, or be slain. And that's it. Or sort of, because to make it even more strange, below the story, Tolkien wrote several more words. Tal-Elmar in Ravanian, Wilderland, Anduin the Great River, the Sea of Rhûn, and Etenmors. Maybe these were just random scribbles, or maybe Tolkien had a far greater plan for Tal-Elmar. Elmar's prophecy and the fact that Tal-Elmar could suddenly understand the language of the Númenóreans certainly suggests so. So now that I've summarised the story, let's pick things apart a bit, because the story is from the perspective of someone entirely alien to what we're used to, so some of the terms are a bit different. Let's start with the where. Agar's exact location isn't known, it's in a hilly region near the coast. In a note in the story, Tolkien suggests that it might have been the River Morthond or at the River Isen. While both are possibilities, Morthond in western Gondor seems more likely, as this region did receive Númenórean settlement. However, being at the River Morthond would mean that Agar is near to Edelond. Given these men feared elves, it's unlikely that they would have had their settlement so close to them. So another possibility is that Agar was further west, perhaps at the River Lefnui, and that the hills of Agar actually correspond with the hills of Penavgelen. As for the timeline of the story, it seems to be set in the late Second Age. The only thing we know for certain is that it's definitely set after the year 1869, because that's when the Númenóreans started changing their approach to Middle-earth, becoming conquerors rather than teachers. In a brief note, Tolkien suggested that it might have been set while Sauron was a prisoner in Númenor, but given the faithful Númenóreans speak of him as if he's still active, that may not be the case either. However, it could still have been set during the reign of Ar-Pharazôn. Elmar's prophecy states that the downfall of Agar's king is close approaching, thus we must also be approaching the downfall of Númenor and the rise of the realms in exile. And this is a term that is also mentioned several times in the story as well, the North King, or simply King. This was almost certainly Sauron, although I'm not sure why he's once referred to as the North King. Every other time he's just referred to as the King. But this would confirm that the men of Agar did worship him, although both Hazad and Tal-Elmar seem entirely ignorant of his true nature, except for the fact that he's associated with the Dark, which they do fear, suggesting that they're aware that he's not a good guy. This lines up with what was occurring in Gondor at this time. We know that many of the pre-Númenóreans fell under Sauron's sway, including the infamous Men of the Mountains, who were cursed by Isildur. Given what happened in the story, it's possible that the Men of Agar ended up joining with the Men of the Mountains, and later became the Oathbreakers as well. So it was Sauron who rallied or commanded the natives to fight the fell folk of the east at the Valley of Ishmalog. We can only guess where that is, but it may mean the lower Vale of Anduin between the White Mountains and Mordor. It's certainly a notable place, and it is to the east. As for the identity of the fell folk of the east, their physical appearance of being tall and grey-eyed would suggest that they were Númenóreans too, although faithful Númenóreans should mostly have dark hair, so Elmar was an outlier. The fact that they were ambushed with wagons and cattle would suggest that they were settlers, something the Númenóreans were actively doing in Gondor at this time. Although it does raise the question as to why Hazad believed the fell folk of the east and the Gohileg were separate people. The Gohileg actually hadn't been seen for many years, so perhaps Hazad had no way of knowing that they were the same people. The last strange term is the Cruels of the North. I think this one is obvious. It's clearly meant to refer to the elves, who the pre-Númenóreans were mostly afraid of because Sauron had been spreading propaganda for a long time that they were cruel. The fact that the Númenóreans on the beach stated that they were allied to them is confirmation that these men were the faithful, as the king's men disliked the elves at this time. It also tells us that the faithful and the elves were working together to combat Sauron even before the downfall of Númenor. In the end, the tale of Tal-Elmar offers an interesting perspective. The pre-Númenóreans who live in Agar are in an unenviable position. They're stuck between Sauron on one side and Númenor on the other. They worship Sauron, they call him king, but many of them fear him and don't understand him. While some, like Mogru, are clearly awful people, Hazad and Tal-Elmar come across well. But regardless, this leads the Númenóreans to broadly label them as enemies, and because they're considered enemies, the Númenóreans, even the faithful, have absolutely no problems with seizing their land and taking it for themselves. As Elmar prophesied, Agar is approaching its end. And Tal-Elmar himself is an enigma. His birth was prophesied by his grandmother. He's an outcast amongst his own people because even though he was born there and speaks their language, he's clearly not one of them. And then he goes to the beach and can suddenly understand Sindarin because he'd heard it in his dreams, and then he suddenly gains the ability to speak it? That's not something that normally happens. And then when you consider Tolkien's cryptic notes at the bottom of the page, was Tal-Elmar supposed to be so much more? Was this short story supposed to become something much greater? We will never know, because Tolkien felt like he had to rewrite Galadriel and Celeborn a couple more times. To the back of the line with you, Tal-Elmar. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, or at least found it interesting. This is one of those videos that when I put out, I have no idea how it's going to do. Will it be popular because no one's heard of it, or will it be unpopular because no one's heard of it? I've been doing this for almost 5 years, and I still don't know anything. If you want to read Tal-Elmar yourself, it's the last chapter in the People of Middle-earth. It's about 17 pages or so long. I did leave out a few minor details that people can discover for themselves if they wish. Cheers, farewell, and remember, Tal-Elmar could literally just be called Tall Elmar, and it wouldn't even be a lie.